Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first presentation in the session on substances of concern. I'm going to be sharing some experiences about 1 year of the SCIP database, presenting some key learnings, and outlining also the way forward. So first, an overview, what's in this presentation. We'll start with the basics. What is the SCIP database and why have we built it? We'll also take a look backwards at the SCIP journey until now, building a database to track substances of very high concern in articles and products. And from now on, I will refer to SVHC, substances of very high concern, is a bit of a mouthful. We'll explain how the SCIP database aims to improve transparency in terms of SVHC. And as I mentioned, we'll take a look also at the future outlook for SCIP. So, what is SCIP and why have we built it? Let's start with the basics at the high level. The SCIP database can be seen as an important element and a first milestone in relation to the EU's Circular Economy Action Plan. The implementation and the legal basis is coming from the Waste Framework Directive, Article 9. And at the core of this is a task for ECHA to establish and maintain a database for information communicated down the supply chain on SVHC and articles, and of course the related duties for companies, suppliers of articles to submit to the database. So why was SCIP included in the Waste Framework Directive? Well, there are a number of reasons. First one being to ensure that sufficient information about the presence of substances of very high concern is communicated through the whole life cycle of products and materials, including to waste operators, what is sometimes called in the circular economy cradle to cradle. So the production and assembly, the use by consumers and professionals of articles, and finally the disposal, dismantling and recycling. This is what we call the cradle to cradle cycle. It also aims to support the reduction of SVHC in materials and products, including in recycled materials. So, to promote the use of waste as a resource, so-called secondary raw materials, and to support in improving current waste management practices. Also very important to promote and support sustainable production and informed choice by consumers making purchasing decisions for articles. I think it's also interesting to note that this is very closely linked with the REACH Article 33 obligation for producer of articles to communicate information to their customers on SVHC in articles within supply chains. So let's take a closer look at the database objectives. As I mentioned, a driver for substitution of SVHCs and prevention of hazardous waste generation, to increase authorities' information basis on substances in articles, and to contribute to a more circular economy, including waste treatment operations. First, a look at some terminology for articles and complex object. So here you have an example of an article, a screw or a washer, and then a complex object. This concept can be explained with the example of a bicycle, which is a complex assembly or a complex object resulting from the putting together or assembly of a number of articles. So that's a simplified view, but hopefully gives you some feel on what we mean by article and complex object. And in layman's terms, we're talking about products, in particular article-based products on the European market. Also to mention what we call the hierarchy concept, because when we receive these different articles and complex objects in the database, we foresaw that it would be useful to have some kind of structure in terms of how this information is submitted, so that we can then identify the location of any SVHC. So hopefully this is relatively intuitive, and you can see how the different parts of the bicycle can be broken down and then further broken down from the wheels to the tires and so on. And if you keep this in mind, this will probably help both this and the subsequent presentations. So that's the main raison d'etre of the database and some key concepts to help you follow the presentation. Let's take a look backwards now at the SCIP journey. So some main milestones, as I mentioned, this database was implemented in the Waste Framework Directive. After some very intense negotiations on the information requirements and working closely with our IT contractor, we launched a prototype database on the 17th of February 2020. And on the 28th of October last year, we reached the first official production version of the submission system, which was in time for the legal obligation towards duty holders on the 5th of January of this year. We published the data in September 2021, and here we are a short while afterwards in October. So the main implementation steps, as I mentioned, work on the database started some time ago in cooperation with the key stakeholders, both industry and the authorities. Having worked on the initial architecture, we also have identified a number of solutions to simplify SCIP submissions and to make life as straightforward as possible for duty holders, whilst recognizing that this is still complex. So we have implemented what we call simplified SCIP notifications, referencing, so the possibility to refer to a notification made by an upstream supplier, and in particular investing in what we call system to system, which enables companies to directly connect their inventory IT to our database and make automatic submissions in an efficient way. As I mentioned last month, we have published the SCIP data, and we're starting to get our first impressions on the content of the database. And of course, going forward, we will continue to support and maintain the database, monitoring, optimizing, and ensuring that the IT systems work as intended. Of course, this facilitates the most important thing, which is the use of data by the target audience, and companies and duty holders, of course, will continue to submit according to their legal obligation. A short word on the different types of submission. Again, we've implemented a number of different submission types to make this as easy as possible for stakeholders. So I'll start with online in the ECHA Cloud service. This is targeted more towards perhaps smaller companies who only need to make a relatively small number of submissions, and they can make notifications one by one in our cloud service. Another approach is to use Euclid 6 for those companies who are more familiar with our Euclid system. And again, this is for a manual notification made one by one towards our database. And then last but not least, we have system to system, which is an automated submission format for companies with large volumes of articles on the market and already having their own IT inventory systems, which can be adapted to submit to us. And as you can see, which was well in line with our expectations, the vast majority of submissions have been coming from what we call system to system. So in terms of the simplified ways to submit data, I mentioned these earlier. We have what we call the simplified SCIP notification, where no dossier is needed. Submission with referencing to a notification already made by an upstream supplier, and then submission without referencing when you make a standalone notification about your product. And you can see here the extent to which these different solutions have been implemented by companies, with the majority without referencing, which is fine, but does lead to some complexities, as I will mention a bit later. Okay, so that's some basics on the submission types. Now let's look at the volumes, and the key message here is that companies are delivering. These data are from the 1st of September 2021, at which time we had received nearly 12 million notifications to the database from nearly 6,000 companies. So companies are certainly delivering, and those companies have clearly responded to their duties. Of course, this database has not been without challenges to the companies. So let's highlight a couple of the key ones. The first maybe is that the SCIP notification obligation was introduced with a relatively short notice in the legislation. This was on the good basis that companies were expected to be better prepared due to the very close link with the Article 33 obligation to communicate the same information down the supply chain. However, we recognize, and it's quite well known, that this obligation has not been optimally complied with. And again, this has created an extra challenge for companies. I mentioned they had a relatively short period of time to prepare for these new obligations. So the complexity of gathering the information in long and complex supply chains, and the related challenges in aligning company IT tracking systems, in particular for system-to-system notifications. Then more from the regulatory side, some practical difficulties in applying what we call the once an article, always an article principle, and some fairly intense discussions and debates on the necessary information requirements and format. Having said that, I would like to bring the main message. We have succeeded together. Companies have responded. The database has been developed on time for the legal deadline. It's up and running with all the essential components, including now the publication of data. And this is the first EU public database on SVHC in products. And again, a landmark milestone towards a circular economy. So I would like to say thank you to all the involved stakeholders, and in particular, the companies who've invested in making appropriate quality submissions. So that's about the database itself, high level, the journey in terms of building it, and high level, the response from companies in terms of the volume of files and the number of companies who've submitted. Let's return now to the key purpose of the database and take a look how SCIP improves transparency for consumers and waste operators. So it's all about making information available and publishing the SCIP data towards consumers and other interested parties and towards waste operators. And important to note, of course, ECHA publishes the information as received on its website. So the usefulness of the information, the quality of the file, of course, is dependent on what has been submitted by the company. So let's start to take a closer look at the content of the database, and I'll start with the consumer view. What we have published is the same view for all actors, but I want to put some emphasis here on which information is perhaps most relevant to consumers, and I'll come in a moment to what additional information might be more interesting to waste operators and perhaps to NGOs or non-government organizations. So consumers will be able to see the name of the article, or as I mentioned, the complex object. You can think of the bicycle or of a car. They can see the brand and model number, the brand and model name, assuming this has been reported. And there are also the possibility to see alphanumeric identifiers, product codes, or even the barcode can be submitted. So what does that mean in practice? Let's imagine a consumer is thinking about buying a watch, perhaps an electronic watch, and they can search in the database for the brand name, the model number, the reference number, and the barcode number. You can see on the right-hand side a simplified version of our search field and how you would enter your search query. And what you will get back is a list of any notifications which match those criteria. And if you click through, you will see a fact sheet for that particular notification, where again, you can see the model of your watch, the brand, the reference number. You can also see, if relevant, any safe use advice instruction for the use of the article or product, or any safe use advice in relation to its safe disposal or recycling. Of course, most relevant, you can also see which candidate list substance, so SVHC, is present, in this case in the watch, and you can see in most cases the location of the SVHC, so which component of the in this case a watch contains the SVHC, again depending on how the notification has been made by the company. So this should enable consumers to find the product, see the instructions on how to use the article safely, if relevant, and how to dispose of it properly. And they can know which SVHCs are present and which hazardous properties they have. So I guess it's self-evident how this can inform consumer choice in terms of understanding which SVHCs are in products they may be considering to purchase. and whether in some cases they may find products, alternative products, which do not contain these substances. So that's high level the consumer view. Let's take a look now at some additional information that we've included, which we think might be more relevant to waste operators or recycling companies. So of course they see the same information, the article name, the brand, the model, and so on. But also you can see what's called the article category. So you can consider this the family of product. This is related to the fact that recyclers normally take large volumes of, for example, cars or plastics. So they might want to see, rather than in addition to the specific product, the category or type of article that it is. They can see the components if this has been submitted correctly, so they can understand which elements, let's say, of the car include the SVHC. Is it the engine block? Is it the gearbox, and so on? And they can also see what we call material and mixture categories. So this is the type of material or substrate where the SVHC might be incorporated or where a component might be housed. And again, this is in relation to the fact that recycling is often based on material streams like metals or plastics and so on. And of course, they can still see the substance of very high concern, which would be of particular importance in recycling operations. So, sticking with the theme of additional information to waste operators, here's an example. And as I mentioned, in this example, you can see that the watch contains SVHC, in this case, lead, titanium, zirconium oxide, in the piezoelectric element, which in principle would allow a recycler to separate that element and handle it differently. And here you can also see the concentration range of the substance of very high concern. And you can see what we call the material category. In this case, it's a specific type of ceramic in the piezoelectric element. So that was most of what I wanted to say high level on the content of the database and how we foresee it will be used by consumers and waste operators. However, I think it's important to highlight and reflect different waste operators, different recycling operators. They have different needs. It's a multi-step process. We have collection, we have disassembly, we have sorting, we have recycling. In some cases, products are prepared for reuse. In others, they are completely broken down to their original substances and mixtures, and these are recycled into the supply chain. My main point with this is that the waste chain is complex. Different waste operators have different needs. And one thing we're particularly interested to understand is, how do waste operators make use of this information? What are the limits of what they can do with this database? And would there potentially be additional needs for different types of reporting in the future? And I'll say more about that a bit later on. So let's take a look now to the future. Clearly, joint efforts are still needed in this context. We will continue to work with the European Commission and the member states, with the duty holders, and as I mentioned, with the users of the data. And in particular, we plan some structured discussions with waste operators to understand what they can do with the information, perhaps to understand any limitations that they experience. And of course, this we can feed back to the Commission, the policymaker, in terms of any potential future developments or improvements to the system. Some advice for the SCIP duty holders, and my colleague Clara Rueda will expand on this in the next presentation. So we would advise you, again, thanks for making your submission, but we would recommend that you take a look and now see how the information is published in the SCIP database. Is your article clearly identified? Is there clear and understandable information towards consumers and recyclers in terms of what we call the hierarchy? If you remember my bicycle example, and being able to understand which components of, in this example, a bicycle contain SVHC, is that clear? Another very important point is to take care not to include commercially sensitive information in your notification, otherwise known as confidential business information. Of course, clearly identifying your product is important, but requires balancing against potentially revealing, for example, who is your supplier. which can result in competition issues. And again, my colleague Clara will say a bit more about that in the next presentation. So based on this, have a look and review your update strategy in case you find shortcomings in your own files. Of course, this all requires further and continued collaboration and improved communication within your supply chain. And last but not least, I would advise you to check our tools and support material. If you are a duty holder or a company, we have a SCIP webpage, which I would highly recommend that you subscribe to. And make sure you use the best tools and strategy for your company for increasing transparency in SCIP. What's next at ECHA? Well, having built and established the database, we are going now into what we would call the stabilization mode. We foresee some further small developments both in the submission and the publication system. We will, of course, continue to offer support through help desk and manuals, and we will continue to gather feedback through our IT user group. Of course, we will continue to make the data available, and as I mentioned, we plan some level of structured discussion with waste operators to understand any limitations they experience, and we will make still some minor improvements to the dissemination or publication portal. We're also having a look from an authority perspective, how we can best use the data in terms of ECHA's integrated regulatory strategy, perhaps supporting our identification of risks of articles, and may lead in some cases to supporting information in the context of restrictions under REACH. And of course, we'll continue to support, according to our mandate, the European Commission and the national authorities. So that was more targeted towards the database itself. Let's come back to the bigger picture towards a circular economy, just to wrap up my presentation. So as I mentioned at the beginning, SCIP is contributing to making information available about products containing SVHC. It's contributing to the safer use and disposal of articles, and it seeks to promote replacement of SVHC with safer alternatives where possible. Good to mention here also, under the circular economy, is the Commission's chemical strategy for sustainability. Still a lot to clarify here, but seems quite clear that there will be further focus in the future on tracking hazardous chemicals, substances of concern, substances of very high concern, all to be clarified within the supply chains. So let's see how that develops and what further steps might be taken in the coming years. And again, the essence of this is reduction of SVHC, safer articles and products, cleaner material cycles, increased use of secondary raw materials rather than primary. And of course, for those companies who have already green and sustainable strategies and have already been able to remove SVHC from their products, this is not only helping them to innovate and take a market advantage, but also avoids the obligation of the need to submit to the SCIP database. Last but not least, I'd like to highlight again the connection between the REACH regulation and SCIP. So registrants of substances are already required to make an assessment of the life cycle of any articles that their substances are going into. This information is already obliged to go down the supply chain towards formulators of mixtures who are then producing materials that are supplied to producers of articles. And in principle, there should already be a good flow of information from the registrant to the formulator, to the material producer, to the article producer. And this can also enhance the ability of article product designers to meet their obligations under SCIP. So REACH foresees that they receive information on the identified use, the hazards, the chemical products, the chemical properties, safe use advice for article production and use, the composition of mixtures, and so on. So just to put that in a bit different perspective, different context, here you can see the full circle, cradle to cradle. We start with the manufacturing of substances. REACH already obliges those registrants to carry out a safety assessment for substances that will go eventually to articles. The SDS system foresees that this information will come to formulators and further will arrive at the producers of articles, which is where the SCIP obligation begins. Then the information goes through the service life of the article and finally to the waste. So this puts a bit the REACH and the SCIP in this more circular perspective, and it will be an area for further attention for ECHA, and as I mentioned, most likely under the chemical strategy also. So in conclusion, let's celebrate this major milestone towards better tracking of SVHC in the supply chain. Thanks again to those companies who've responded. And as I mentioned, some advice on some next steps. And we encourage consumers, waste operators, all interested parties to make use of the database, but also take note of its limitations and further needs. So thank you very much. I hope you found this useful.